Welcome to Learning DSLR, Back to Basics. My name is Phil Dame. In this episode, episode 9, I'm going to be covering off a couple important but challenging topics. One is color management as it compares to color correction, and we're going to talk about device profiling and calibration. Now, first of all, what is accurate color? You've got a subject here in a red dress. A true accurate color would translate all the way to the finished product, and let's say that's a printed photo. Then you're going to want an exact color match. And so getting from reality to that finished product, the output with accurate color, is the ultimate goal, and that's what we're talking about today. Now, accurate color comes through consistent color because there's so many devices involved, and color is considered to be a device-dependent issue. Your camera, your monitor, and your printer are all dealing with color in a very different way. So your camera or your scanner is considered the input, and so you need to be sure that you've got consistent color from the moment you take that photo or scan the photo. Then you've got to make sure that as you work with the digital file that you're processing it properly and that you're looking at colors accurately. And then finally, when you output it to a printer or send it to a lab to get a print or a canvas made, you want to make sure that the colors you're expecting to get are going to be what you receive. Now, there is this concept of color correction, and that happens at the process stage where you might be adjusting for different coloring situations or white balance. And color correction is just part of the process. And certainly it's something that you can't do accurately if you never got the initial color correctly, or if you're looking at a monitor that's not showing color properly. And it won't really matter if you correct colors perfectly in your monitor if you can't ultimately print them or output them. So what we're really talking about is color management and not color correction. Now let's look at color management. It's actually fairly complex because there's so many variables that come into play. You've got your subject here in the red dress, and you in fact have, just from a basic lighting standpoint, different light sources that have different white balance and different kind of qualities to it. And I do have an episode on white balance if you're interested. Now you've got different light sources playing a role in color. Now you've got your camera, but also its lenses can have variances in terms of color saturation and all kinds of things. And then when you're ultimately processing it, you've got both the software and the monitor that are playing a role in representing color to you visually. And there's even ambient light in the room that can have an impact. So you have to be cognizant of that as well. And then finally, on the output side, of course, the printer doesn't even use the same kind of color model as your monitor, A, and then B, the actual output material, the paper, if it's glossy or not, or it has color, is all going to have an impact on the final product. So if you're not careful, your initial image might not represent that red properly. Then you're going to be processing and trying to make color correction and adjustments with a monitor that is also incorrectly calibrated. And then you've got output that's going to be perhaps very dull and completely off of the original, so it's really not the desired result. So how do you get through this? You need to have a color management workflow or a color management system that ensures consistent and accurate color. And these are done through what's called profiles. And so you can have a profile for your camera, a profile for your monitor, and a profile for your printer. And in effect, a profile is a way of translating all of the kind of idiosyncrasies of the specific device and bringing them to a common standard, so that instead of having a device-dependent color system, you've got a device-independent color management system. And so you've got a true representation that a red from your camera is going to be the exact same red on your monitor and as close as possible to the red that you want on output. Now let's talk about camera profiles specifically and how that's done. There is a standard color target that you can get, and I'll talk about this in greater detail later in terms of product recommendations. And what that does is it allows you to take a picture of that color target and then bring that into a computer to create a profile. On what a profile is, in this case it's called a DNG profile, is it's software that looks at those colors. It knows that that color target is made exactly the way it should be. And so if the red in the middle is not showing up as red in the finished file, it's able to adjust for that and create almost like a translation saying your camera and that lens, or at least this particular situation, even particular to a single scene or lighting situation, requires that reds be boosted, for example. So then it saves that as a profile so that all subsequent edits to photos taken in that situation, say that lens under that lighting situation, will always have the red boosted a bit, because that's what brings it to the standard, to a standard of what red is. So what's happening here is that you're buying a color target that is exactly calibrated itself to be perfect, and then having software that matches with that, and you photograph that and create a profile. Cameras do ship with these, and we're only talking about cameras. When you're talking about DSLR cameras, we're only talking about RAW photographs, not JPEG photographs. Cameras and the software you use, like Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop, have profiles for your camera that are quite accurate. But this is something you can do to make sure that you're getting the most accurate color from your actual capture device, which is your camera. So once you have a calibrated kind of a camera profile, it's important to note that you're not loading this back into the camera. It is something that ultimately lives in the computer, and you choose it in the software, and I'll show you that in a moment. One other kind of camera profile that you're going to hear about is called a dual illuminant profile. And the only difference there is that rather than shooting the color target once for a particular lighting situation, there is a way to shoot the color target twice. You're taking two photos, one under a more daylight situation from a color temperature standpoint, like flash or sunlight, and one in a much warmer lighting situation, like incandescent light. And what you do is you take those two photos and feed it to the exact same software, and you're making another profile, but it's called a dual illuminant profile. And what that's doing is it tells the software, here's a range of situations, very bluish light to very warmish light, and look at how my camera is reacting to that. It's either, reacts poorly on one end and well on the other, but it's giving it the whole range. And what the software can do is come up with a profile to cover off almost nearly any situation you're going to shoot, so that you don't have to shoot this color target all the time. What you've done is you've profiled it once with this broad range of color situations, and then fed that to your computer so that you're getting consistent color now, and you're going to be picking that profile for all your subsequent edits. And when I mean pick the profile, I mean you're creating a file on your computer and then you actually pick it. So here's what it looks like in Adobe Lightroom. On the left is under camera calibration, which is in the develop module. You can actually pick the profile that you create with this software. And if you're just using a Photoshop with Adobe Camera Raw, you can go to the tab with the camera icon and pick the same profile there. So this is something that you can do to be, again, very precise in terms of controlling color from the input standpoint. Now let's talk about the process stage. So what you need to do for monitor profiling is use a device called a colorimeter. It's a color measuring device. And these devices, of course, are going to be paired with your monitor and some software. First of all, the colorimeter takes into account the ambient light in the room, because it is one of the factors that affects how color looks on your monitor. And you're going to actually place this right on the monitor itself, and the software is going to cycle through a number of different kind of contrast levels and colors. And what you're going to be doing is calibrating the monitor, which is to say you're going to be bringing the monitor to a standard, to a kind of a standard state, a certain color temperature at a certain intensity. And the process of characterizing the monitor means you're going to be exposing it to known values and seeing how the monitor reacts, and then storing that kind of custom fingerprint or translation to the standard in what's called a profile. And these are called ICC profiles, whereas ICC is the name of a standards body that controls the color management standards that are out there for devices. So here's an example of where that ICC, that .ICC file appears on a Mac. It's in the display area under color. And in Windows, I think it might be a .icm file, and it'll be in a similar area where you manage your monitor profiles. Now, printer profiling is very similar to camera profiling in the sense that you're creating a color target, kind of a color grid that can be measured, but instead of producing a color grid to be photographed, you're using the printer to print out those color squares, and you're using a very similar color measuring device, and you will literally place that on the paper and measure each of the squares following the instructions of the software, and it'll know now that your printer, for example, prints its reds pretty orange, with too much orange tint to them, and so it can adjust for that to try and make them more of a true red. So again, what you're creating there is an ICC profile as well, and that's something again that you store on the computer, not inside the printer. And from a Mac and standpoint, this is how it looks. If you might be using a Canon printer, you could choose color matching and then be picking the exact profile. It might be automatically selected, but you can manually select a profile that you've created. And in Lightroom, which is shown on the right-hand side, when you go to do a print job, there's a color management section. And again, there's a profile drop-down, and you can pick the profile that you've created with the software that comes with these calibration devices. So how do you get started, and how much investment do you need to have to make sure that you get a good, clean, accurate picture? The key here is that if you're not doing your own photo printing, the whole printing equation somewhat comes out of the equation. If I'm going to be sending this to a professional lab, even if I'm just sending it to a Costco or Walmart, which is not ideal, but their machines, their expensive machines, are themselves already calibrated and are going to be following ICC standards. And so as long as you're working with the photo and looking at accurate colors on your part prior to sending off those files for printing, then you've got a much better start. And so if you're not printing, you don't have to worry about the printing side of things. As I mentioned earlier, cameras and the software like Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop come with profiles made for very specific camera models, and they themselves are quite accurate. Those profiles are not going to cover off very unique lighting situations that you might be in, but provide a very, very solid starting point for working with color. And so the biggest weakness ends up being your monitor. Most monitors end up, in my perspective from the color management I've done, are much more blue than they should be. And so once you do color calibration profiling of a monitor, you're going to be in a much better place. And so for me, that's where you should invest. Here's a sample product that you can get just to give you a sense of what's available. The company x-rite seems to be a leader in this space. This is the device I've actually purchased. It's called the x-rite Color Monkey. It goes for about $170. It doesn't do printer profiling, but it does do monitor profiling. And as I mentioned, monitor profiling is really where you want to start. If you're interested in getting a color calibration target that you photograph, the x-rite, same company, Color Checker Passport for $100 is highly recommended. It's a color card in this kind of like ruggedized case. It comes with a white balance card as well, and the software necessary to do all the profile creation. Integrates with Lightroom very well if you're into Lightroom. So it's a great kit. So not necessary, but if you want to have a much more solid color management workflow, then you would want to have both this and the monitor profiler. And they do actually sell that as a bundle, which will save you about $50. You can get the x-rite Color Checker Passport and the x-rite Color Monkey display for $220. So certainly there are many other products out there. This is just one that I have some experience with. I have both of those products. I do not have a product for profiling a printer because I do not print my own photographs, at least not now. And so I don't want to recommend anything I don't use, but certainly if you do your research, you can find lots of interesting options. I would look to the company x-rite because they seem to be the leader in this space. So I hope that brief introduction was useful, and if you've got any questions, feel free to contact me at any time. If you haven't done so already, check out my blog at learningdslr.com, and I'm on the social web on both Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.